Hey everyone, this lecture is going to be on the process of collecting data. Um, and we're going to talk in this lecture about collecting quantitative data, qualitative data. We'll touch briefly on collecting mixed methods data. Um, the data could be primary data, which is sometimes called original data, might also be secondary data. We're going to discuss the differences between those two as well. But literally, this is sort of where the methodology of the research study is operationalized. So participants have been selected from a population of people. We've identified what questions we're going to ask, and now we're literally going out to interact with participants. First way to do that is to think about collecting survey data. There's a couple of ways that this could be done, or a couple of ways that it traditionally has been done. For example, one way it might be done is simply mailing surveys to participants. More on that in a second. We might also meet with participants, or we might simply make phone calls to participants. Now you may say, "Oh, we're missing, the internet or email or something like that." Well, we'll talk about that here in a second, because that's really sort of an extension of these three methods right here. So let's suppose that we're simply mailing surveys to participants. What we might do is assemble a packet of information and drop it in the mail. Typically, that packet or that package of information would include an introductory letter, maybe a consent form, some instructions, the survey instruments themselves, and then a return envelope, usually with postage paid by the part of the researcher, or on the part of the researcher, and then usually some information about an incentive. We're going to touch on incentives a couple of different times during the course of this lecture here today. Mailing surveys is nice. There is some cost associated with it, of course, but participants can sort of complete them at their leisure and mail them back. The meeting with participants typically involves a participant coming to a clinic or a research office. It might also involve a researcher traveling to a location of the participant's choice, say their home or a coffee shop or a restaurant or something where they feel comfortable. But during a meeting with a participant, the researcher might conduct an interview, which literally could take the form of reading the questions and recording responses. Might take the form of handing the participant a stack of the research and the survey instruments and a pen or a pencil, or it might take the form of giving the participant a computer or a tablet or a phone or something like that. Maybe going to a certain web page where they can work through the survey instruments themselves, sort of at their own pace. The nice part about meeting with participants is that there's a question that's unclear or something that's causing the participant to get stuck. The researcher can sort of troubleshoot with them. Phone calls are also occasionally done. And phone calls are actually pretty wieldy. We're going to talk about this here in a second. But in a phone call, the researcher literally has to read the survey question and the response to the participant, who then sort of responds with an answer. These, of course, have a number of advantages and disadvantages. I mean, they all have advantages and disadvantages. Mailing is fairly inexpensive, at least compared to meeting with participants or making phone calls. Copying is pretty cheap. Postage is pretty cheap. You can actually structure postage so that you're only paying for the return postage if the survey instruments are actually mailed back. That's simply a nonprofit or a business license or a business business agreement with the post office. Mailing typically results in a fairly low response rate. 10 to 20% is the normal response rate. Certainly, I've seen surveys where the response rate is in the single digits. And so that simply means that for every 100 surveys that you're, or 100 packages that you're mailing out, what percentage are you expecting to be returned? If it's in the single digits, for every 100 you mail out, you're expecting 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or so to be returned. So there can be sort of a mismatch between the amount of work and the amount of data that you're actually receiving back. But the sort of key theme to this entire lecture is to match your data collection methods with what the research question is. And if that kind of response rate works for your for your research question, then that's perfectly fine. Making phone calls is probably one of the more expensive ways to collect data. It's good for random sampling because you can do random digit dials and that kind of thing. However, it's really cumbersome for participants because they have to sort of sit there and listen to all the questions and responses that are being asked of them, and then respond. So phone calls are typically good for shorter surveys. And surveys where you sort of need to be sure that you're getting all of the information from a participant that you possibly can get. Of course, phone calls are pretty expensive because you have to pay someone to make the phone calls, and then you also get a lot of hang-ups and misdials and ignores and things like that, especially now that we're in the era of sort of caller ID, and people can see that they don't, if they don't always pick up the phone if it's a number that they don't recognize. Certainly, I think phone surveys and things like that they're widely used in sort of political surveys, which candidate does a voter prefer, that kind of thing. They were widely used sort of in the era of before the internet, when people didn't have caller ID and were much more likely to pick up phone calls. Meeting with participants is probably sort of the happy medium of phone calls and mailing things to participants. It does place some burden on the participant. They, of course, have to travel to your location. Although if you meet at a location of the participant's choosing, that can be helpful. Although I've certainly met with participants at coffee shops or restaurants or in generally public places when I've wanted to ask participants about pretty personal and sensitive issues. So it can be tough. You sort of want to ensure that the participant feels comfortable with people overhearing them. And certainly I've met with participants in their own home. But then again, you have to be, one has to be sensitive to sort of asking a researcher to go into someone else's home, especially if it's a person that they don't know. So again, there are pros and cons for each of these things, and the idea here is to maximize the advantages and minimize the disadvantages. Typically, if you have money for research, the research will pay for the participant to travel to your location. So I've reimbursed participants with bus tokens or gas cards. I've written checks for mileage, that kind of thing. And certainly one of the nice things about meeting with a participant at either the researcher's location or a location of their choosing is you can survey multiple people at once. So I've taken a couple of different laptop computers to people, a group of 2 or 3 or 4 people, and I've set them all up, and they've sort of worked through the survey instruments as they needed to. You can use your phone as a hotspot, or I worked on a project once where we had a little hotspot Wi-Fi device, and we would just set up 2 or 3, 4 or 4 computers for people, and they'd sort of complete them. We started to use tablets sort of late in that project, and that was sort of useful too. We would just go to a particular SurveyMonkey page and and set people up. Now, of course, the internet, email, social media is something that we should sort of think about too. And oftentimes, instead of mailing materials to participants, links can be emailed. They can be advertised on social media. They can be advertised on the internet. This helps to reduce costs because now you're not paying for things and you're not paying for postage. So that actually makes conducting this kind of research pretty inexpensive, pretty darn close to free. Maybe not quite free, but pretty close to free. Of course, there's some disadvantages as well. We don't know who's completing materials when they're emailed to us. There is this concept of a professional subject, and that's sort of people who are on the lookout for incentives or essentially payments from research, and they simply complete surveys posing as whoever it is the researcher is looking for in order to get the gift card or the compensation or whatever the incentive is. However, if what the researcher is looking for is just sort of a cross-sectional, convenient sample data, then blasting out a link to a survey over social media or over email is useful. There isn't much buy-in on the part of the participant. There doesn't really need to be. So it probably you can't really do this. You can't really use email blasts and social media advertisements for longitudinal research. But again, if what you're looking for is sort of a cross-sectional short survey or something like that, then this can be useful. And it does typically preserve anonymity and confidentiality. You don't have to collect any identifying information about the participant, and that's pretty useful. So again, the key term or the key idea here is to sort of balance the advantages and the disadvantages with what the research question is and sort of what the ethical stumbling blocks of the research study are. So let's talk about qualitative interviews next. Qualitative interviews typically take one of two forms, although these are not sort of hard and fast forms. There can be one-to-one interviews, which is typically the interviewer and the participant, so the researcher and the participant. There are also sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, the focus groups. We'll talk about those in a second. The category of sort of one-to-one interviews, we often lump 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 interviews, sometimes, family interviews, that kind of thing in there. And the reason for that is that typically in a 1-to-1 interview or a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 interview, the group of people have some kind of pre-existing relationship. So it could be a couple, a dyad. It could be a family, could be a group of friends, right? A group of 2 or 3 friends. But the point is they have some kind of pre-existing relationship. In contrast, in a focus group, people typically have something in common, but they don't know each other. They don't have any pre-existing relationship. They're simply part of the same group. They're all, for example, people, parents who have a child with a disability, or people who have a loved one in the military or something like that. So they don't know each other, but they all have something in common. Focus groups, typically, I've seen them as small as 4. I've done them as large as 12. Much more than 12 is tough just because it gets really cumbersome and it's hard for people to sort of get a contribution in. So I think, 8 to 10 is probably a good number, depending on the intensity of the responses that you're expecting from people. Much more than 10 or 12, and it starts to get really cumbersome. Focus groups are useful when you want participants to sort of riff off of each other, when you want participants to sort of get inspiration from other participants in the focus group and sort of build on those sentiments. However, of course, focus groups have their own sort of set of pitfalls, and that's that they can be easily derailed by one person who dominates the conversation, or one person who just throws something unexpected out there, which sort of sends the conversation out into left field or something like that. And of course, one-to-one or two-to-one interviews have their own pitfalls. Participants don't really have the ability to sort of build on what other people are saying. So again, the takeaway message here is sort of what's best suited for your research question. Qualitative interviews also typically take one of two forms: structured interviews or unstructured interviews. The difference is really pretty simple. In a structured interview, questions are simply predetermined. A researcher might have a list of 6 or 8 or 10 questions that she wants to ask a participant or a focus group. In an unstructured interview, maybe there's one question, and then you sort of let the conversation or the interview take a really organic course. Again, which one you choose depends an awful lot on the kind of thing that you're interested in. I typically think that structured interviews are useful for one-to-one interviews, and unstructured interviews are useful for focus groups. That again, the utility of that, especially in a focus group, is that you can sort of let the conversation proceed in a direction that's really sort of organic, or where the group wants it to go. A couple of things to keep in mind in qualitative work. We're asking in qualitative work, we're using open-ended questions, and we're interested in people's sentiments and descriptions, and so in the spirit of that, people misremember things, they idealize things. I've seen participants in a focus group compete with one another for sort of the most extreme story. I've seen participants derail focus groups. But this is sort of where trained facilitators can sort of probe participants, help them remember. They can ask clarifying questions to sort of minimize the idealization or that social desirability bias. They can redirect participants who are trying to dominate the conversation, or trying to sort of undermine the direction of the conversation. That this is where facilitators, like I said, need some training and need to feel sort of competent and empowered. Oftentimes, new qualitative researchers will partner with a more seasoned qualitative researcher to help with that facilitation process. Qualitative interviews in general are useful when the researcher is really interested in sort of an idiosyncratic process, something that's really individualized and doesn't lend itself to the sort of generalization or generalization that quantitative work does. It's useful when we're looking for sort of emotional content that would be hard to capture in quantitative work as well. So the next sort of category of data collection is observational data. And observational data is simply when a researcher observes a participant in a natural or a laboratory setting. So lots of examples of this. I've put just a few up there. And so imagine that you were simply observing how a stop sign at a four-way intersection or whatever, some kind of intersection or something like that. One example of observational research might be how many people come to a complete stop before proceeding through that intersection. You might also ask how many, a pedestrian, how many people look both ways before crossing that street. In a laboratory environment, you might bring in children to see how they interact with a new toy. You in a sort of natural or laboratory environment For example, you might see how people navigate a website. How do they look for information? How do they get to a specific point on that website? I mean, there are literally, thousands and thousands of questions you could ask with sort of observational kinds of data. So one of the important things to ask is do participants know they're being observed? And if they do know that they're being observed, how does that knowledge impact their sort of true behavior? If you bring people into a lab, they often know that they're being observed. They're aware that this is sort of a synthetic environment. If you're working with kids and maybe you want to study how kids interact with a new toy, then maybe that's fine because that's not really going to change their behavior all that much. If you're doing maybe a study where you are looking for you're trying to test reflexes or something like that, a lab might be perfectly fine because a person's reflexes probably don't change much from a natural environment to a laboratory kind of environment. Again, which method you use should be sort of suited to the kinds of research question you're asking. If I go back to this here for a second, if you're observing how many cars come to a complete stop at a stop sign, you don't really need to do something like that in a lab. In fact, it would be very difficult to do that in a laboratory environment. But on the other hand, you can also probably observe participants fairly unobtrusively. Most people probably wouldn't know that they were being observed. They would simply see someone standing off to the side of the intersection, maybe with a clipboard. They wouldn't think twice about it. Of course, the key question here is, does knowledge that they're being observed impact their behavior? This is known as the Hawthorne effect, and I sometimes sort of jokingly refer to this as the reality TV effect. And that the principle or the definition of this sort of effect is that people change their behavior when they know that others are watching. They might exaggerate certain things. They might sanitize certain things. They might act more dramatically in the case of reality TV, or they might simply act in a way that makes them appear more likable or more desirable. Now, this gets us to the point where we're thinking about what's the role of the researcher, and there's really a spectrum of different roles that the researcher can take in an observational study. And that spectrum really ranges from a complete participant to a complete observer. So when the researcher is a complete participant, they move that process forward. And this is useful in advocacy research, maybe where a group of people is trying to get the attention of policymakers or local government or a corporation or something like that. When a participant is a complete observer, this is useful for those unobtrusive studies when you're counting, when you're counting the number of cars that sort of come to a complete stop at an intersection, or when you're looking for how a child is interacting with a toy. That's unobtrusive. There's no you're trying to minimize the effect of the researcher on the participant there. Then in the middle, you have the sort of participant as observer, or observer as participant. And this is useful when the researcher wants to provide varying levels of input to the process that participants are engaging in. And again, what's right is sort of what's most suited to the kinds of to the kind of research question that you're asking. So let me just move. Why don't I put myself here real quick, just while we talk about these kinds of things. So how do you decide which role is right for the researcher? Well, you start by asking yourself if knowledge of research presence would change the participant's behavior, and if so, would that change be problematic or not? Sometimes a researcher's expertise is needed to move the process along or to achieve a certain kind of outcome. This particular field of research is often called community-based participatory action research. Sometimes you hear it just as participatory action research. And this is oftentimes when a marginalized community is trying to get the attention of policymakers or a corporation or something like that. So when the North Dakota or when the Dakota Access Pipeline was being built, there were a number of researchers out there who were trying to advocate on behalf of the First Nations group, and so they were really acting as complete participants because their expertise was needed to move that process forward. In some ways, in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, it may have been unethical for the researcher to act as a complete observer because the researcher might have had a particular set of skills or expertise that would have been useful for the group trying to advocate for a specific outcome. The other sort of questions to ask when you're deciding on a role for the researcher is whether or not the researcher is part of that community, whether or not their presence sort of violates principles of privilege, cultural competence, things like that. The key thing here is that people, when they know they're being observed, they often unintentionally change their behavior, and oftentimes those changes are subtle but still meaningful. Sometimes researchers are willing to tolerate those subtle, unintentional changes in behavior. It doesn't really make much difference in to the quality of the research, but sometimes it does. And so researchers really approach a role for the researcher. They approach it anew each time and sort of think about the kinds of research question that they're asking. Oops, sorry about that. So keep in mind, observational data can be qualitative or quantitative. Let me give you a couple examples of that. If we go back to our stop sign example, or I suppose a crosswalk example would work for this as well. We could ask quantitative close-ended kinds of questions. Did the participant look left? Did they look right? Did they look both ways? Do we get the sense that the participant looked carefully or superficially in either or both direction? So obviously those first three questions are sort of examples of close-ended quantitative questions. The fourth question is much more qualitative and open-ended, and all of them might be meaningful depending on the kinds of goals of the research question. Another example, we might think about a lab, so a sort of cloistered and sanitized environment. We could ask both qualitative and quantitative questions of observing a child playing with a new toy in a lab. How many minutes did they play with it? That's actually an interesting quantitative question. And then we might ask things like, in what ways did they interact with it? How did they incorporate it into their patterns of play? And that's sort of an interesting qualitative question that a researcher might be interested in. Oops, sorry about that. Let me just move myself back down here. Next category of data really is secondary data. And secondary data is typically quantitative, and it simply means that it's been collected by someone else. And in the case of secondary data, the researcher is reanalyzing or conducting a new analysis on that data. There's lots of examples of this. The federal government, for example, often funds very large studies that are sort of epidemiological or behavioral in nature. I put a couple of acronyms up there. The NESARC study is the National Epidemiologic Study of Alcoholism and Related Conditions. It's simply a big study. I mean, thousands and thousands of participants. It's a big study of drinking, smoking, gambling related, psychopathology and addictive behaviors. The YR, that acronym is, I switched the B and the F. It should be the YRBFSS. That's the Youth Risk Behavioral. No, I'm sorry, I'm going to get this wrong. Youth Risk Factor Behavioral Surveillance Survey. That's what it is. Youth Risk Factor Behavioral Surveillance Survey. That's so I did have the acronym right. That's simply a large study of youth and study of risk factors, so things that sort of precipitate drinking and smoking and skipping school and speeding and not wearing seatbelts and things like that. Occasionally, you think about secondary data as data collected by another research team or a supervisor. That's often the case when master's or PhD students are looking for a project and they reanalyze data that was collected by maybe a mentor or supervisor or something like that. But oftentimes, secondary data is sort of large government data or government contract data. And there's a couple of advantages to this. It's typically free. It's typically easily available. Sometimes you have to apply to use the data. But in many cases, the application is simply your name. What are you going to do with it? What kinds of questions do you want to ask? In the case of federal government surveys, this data usually is pretty high quality. So it's usually a huge sample size. I mean, thousands and thousands of people. So it can be representative. Their methodology is pretty rigorous. So they have really high completion rates. They don't always have much missing data. Sometimes they do. But of course, with secondary data, since it's such a massive, expensive, labor-intensive undertaking, it can be dated. The NESARC data, I think the last time they did that was 2005, maybe. So that data is fairly old. They do update the risk behavior or the youth risk behavior surveillance survey, I think every 2 or 3 years, but the sample size isn't quite as big. And of course, this is secondary data, so you're really limited to the variables in the original study. You can't go back and ask, insert new variables or insert new questions or re-interview participants. That data has already been collected. It can be tough to parse out new research questions. There's people who sort of make a career out of analyzing secondary data, and when new data are released, they sort of swoop in and do a bunch of analyses. But if you've got a new analytic technique or a sort of a new way to sort of section the data, that can result in sort of some interesting questions. Secondary data really is a good option for master's projects and dissertations, because you don't have to spend your time collecting data. You can sort of move right to the analysis portion. So which data collection method is best really depends on your research question, and it depends an awful lot on the area of inquiry. Most areas have established methods, so they have a way of sort of doing things. And the way you get a sense of how things are done in that particular field is to read the studies that have been published in that particular field. And then you emulate the methods. You draw inspiration from the studies that you've read. This is why that literature review portion of a research project is so important. Not only does it help you get a sense of the variables and the relationship between those variables in an area, it also helps you get a sense of the methodologies that are frequently used in a given area. Social workers often use quantitative, when they're doing quantitative work, they often use survey methods. We often use qualitative work to develop new theories or new interventions. Speaking of interventions, interventions are really just sort of survey work that incorporates a longitudinal method and some kind of treatment. So you're simply going to interview participants more than once and do some kind of intervention in between the interview points, the assessment points, the observation points. So give some thought to how participants will be tracked over time. How are you going to link the pre-test and the post-test? How are you going to protect confidentiality or anonymity One way to do that is to limit access to data to the research team. And then the other way to do that is to sort of de-identify it. So you assign participants a number, or you ask them to create a number that they can remember. And then you use that to link the pretest to the post-test as opposed to a person's name. Mixed methods research sort of incorporates both qualitative and quantitative approaches. Is sort of referred to as that third, like a third methodology. Qualitative and quantitative would be sort of the first two methodologies. But here's an example of sort of a mixed method survey. You might survey 100 people. Maybe you're giving them measures, on a couple of different things. Then you randomly select 10 of those surveys for interviews. Another example might be you survey 100 people. You give them, a sort of a battery of assessments or a battery of measures on whatever variables are of interest. And then maybe you take the 10 that have scored the highest on a particular measure, or so the 10 that are sort of the most depressed, they score the highest on measures of depression, or the 10 people who are sort of most severe, and you select them for interviews. There's lots of ways to do this. Those are just sort of two examples, but the key point about mixed methods here is that they typically involve the advantages of qualitative and quantitative research. So a couple of closing remarks here. Keep in mind, we rarely expect participants to participate in research for free. There's often an incentive. That incentive typically depends on how long it takes the participants to complete the measures in the study. For my dissertation, it took people about half an hour to complete most methods. That's what I estimated, and that's sort of what it came out to be. And so I compensated people $15. The rationale was that was $30 an hour. That seemed reasonable. It was sort of the going rate based on other studies in the field. So participants who completed all of the measures in my study got a $15 gift card. We also, if we're asking participants to come to us, that travel is reimbursed. So with a bus token, with a gas card, taxi ride, Uber ride, that kind of thing. The exception to the sort of incentive and reimbursement thing are probably unobtrusive observational studies. In those cases, participants might not even know that they're being that they're sort of taking part in the study. We're simply observing behavior, counting particular behavior. We're not really interested in emotional or thought process behind that particular behavior. Regardless of which data collection methods we choose, researchers always keep ethics in mind, and we're always working to protect those three big ethical principles. But in addition to keeping ethics in mind, we're also sort of trying to develop a cohesive methodological strategy. So our methodology sort of needs to take into account sampling, the design, the instrumentation, what's been done before. Most importantly, research methodology needs to be able to answer your research question. You need to be sure that you pose a question that you can then answer with your with a methodology that you're thinking about. And this is again why reviewing the literature in your area is so important, because that helps you get an idea of what's been done, what's sort of the norm for that particular area. And that again we do this in the lit review portion of the research project. So I believe, yep, that's everything. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.